They say truth is supposed to set you free, but sometimes the truth doesn't release you, it breaks you open, forcing you to face the blood that binds you to your pain. After the ashes settle, what remains are the wounds we inherited and the choices we make to heal them. This is Unforgiven, Part 3, The Wound of a Mother, a story about guilt, forgiveness, and the moment a woman learns that love can hurt and still be holy. The rain had returned to Portland thin, steady, deliberate. It wasn't the kind that demanded attention. It was the kind that reminded you the sky still remembered how to weep. Evelyn Hart sat in her car across from a small blue house on Hawthorne Avenue. She had been there before years ago, when she still wore Ryan Blake's last name and called his mother Mom. Margaret Blake's house looked exactly the same. The hydrangeas were overgrown, the front steps chipped, the same wind chime still clinked near the window. The sound used to comfort Evelyn. Now it sounded like time itself refusing to stop ringing. She turned off the engine, grabbed the umbrella from the passenger seat, and stepped into the rain. Each step up the porch felt heavier than the last. When the door opened, Margaret stood there in her faded cardigan, thinner than Evelyn remembered, but still holding that same soft strength in her eyes. "Evelyn," she said quietly, "not cold, not warm, just surprised." "I know I should have called," Evelyn replied. "I just needed to see you." Margaret opened the door wider. "Come in, dear. It's still raining." The house smelled like chamomile tea and old photographs. There was a blanket draped across the sofa, a stack of unopened mail, a faint hum of the heater in the background. Evelyn sat down slowly, her umbrella dripping near the door. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Margaret broke the silence first. "I watch the news," she said, "about Charles, about Ryan. I wish I could say I was shocked." Evelyn looked down at her hands. "I didn't come here to talk about them. Not really. I came because I've missed you." The older woman's eyes softened. "And yet, every time I see you, it's because something terrible has happened. That's life, I suppose," Evelyn said with a faint smile. "We always meet in the ruins." Margaret poured tea, 2 cups, just like she always did. One for the guest, one for the truth. She sat across from Evelyn and studied her face. "You look tired," she said, "but different, stronger." Evelyn met her gaze. "Strong doesn't mean healed." "No," Margaret said. "But it means you're still standing." They drank in silence for a while. The rain tapped against the windows like a soft, relentless metronome. Then Evelyn reached into her bag and pulled out a folded photograph. She slid it across the table. "I found this in the Harts and files," she said. "I thought you should see it." Margaret hesitated before picking it up. Her fingers trembled. The photo was old, the colors faded, the edges worn. It showed Charles Quinn, younger but unmistakable, standing beside a woman in her 20s. The woman was smiling, but her eyes were terrified. Margaret's breath caught. The cup in her hand clattered against the saucer. "Where did you get this?" she whispered. "It was buried in the company archives," Evelyn said softly. "There were letters, too, from him, to a woman named Margaret Hale. That's your maiden name, isn't it?" Margaret didn't answer. She just stared at the photograph, her lips trembling. "Margaret," Evelyn said gently, "I think he's the man who hurt you." The older woman shut her eyes, as if the sound of it might split her open. When she finally spoke, her voice came out like broken glass. His name wasn't Charles Quinn back then. It was Henry Vaughn. I met him in 1988 in Louisiana. I was working at a small supply store. He said he was traveling for business. She paused, eyes far away. He wasn't. He was running from debt, from his past. I was 23. He was charming. I thought he loved me. Evelyn's stomach tightened. She didn't interrupt. One night, Margaret continued, her voice shaking. He forced himself on me, said I was his, that he'd come back for me once he'd made something of himself. Her hands gripped the photo. He never did. I found out I was pregnant 2 months later. My family sent me away. I raised Ryan alone. The name fell between them like a ghost. Evelyn whispered, "Margaret, are you saying Charles Quinn is Ryan's father?" Margaret's tears fell silently onto the photo. "I didn't know until today. Until this moment, I didn't want to know." Evelyn sat back, her pulse ringing in her ears. The truth felt too big for the room, too cruel to breathe. "That means," she said quietly, "Ryan's father is the man who destroyed my family, the man I put in prison." Margaret nodded slowly, her voice barely a whisper. "And the man who ruined mine." For a long while, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the rain and the faint ticking of the old kitchen clock. Evelyn finally said, "I'm sorry." For what Margaret asked, for all of it, for Charles, for Ryan, for everything that happened because I couldn't see what was right in front of me. Margaret shook her head. "Don't. This isn't your sin to carry. That man took something from both of us, from everyone he touched. But I'll tell you something. Evelyn, the worst thing he ever did wasn't the lying or the stealing. It was teaching people like us how to hate ourselves for surviving him." Evelyn looked at her, tears brimming. How do you stop hating something like that? You don't, Margaret said softly. You just make sure it ends with you. She reached across the table, took Evelyn's hand. Her fingers were cold but steady. Don't let his name become your story. Don't let his shadow decide how you live. Evelyn nodded slowly, swallowing the lump in her throat. Then Margaret whispered, Ryan doesn't know yet. Please, let me be the one to tell him. A mother should carry her own truth. Evelyn agreed. He deserves to hear it from you. Margaret smiled faintly. No, dear, he doesn't deserve it. But I'll tell him anyway. Because love isn't about who deserves it. It's about who still needs it. The rain outside began to fade, the clouds thinning. Evelyn looked through the window, gray light breaking apart. The first fragile thread of dawn creeping through. When she stood to leave, Margaret walked her to the door. Evelyn, she said, her voice trembling but firm. I don't know what you'll do with this truth, but whatever comes next, don't let vengeance be the only thing that keeps you breathing. Evelyn met her gaze. I won't, not this time. As she stepped into the clearing rain, the world felt sharper, heavier, but also clearer. Behind her, in that small, quiet house, a mother clutched an old photograph and wept, not just for what she'd lost, but for the child who would soon learn the truth of his own blood. And for the first time, Evelyn understood what her father once meant when he said, the hardest part of truth isn't finding it. It's surviving the people who hide behind it. The next morning broke with a thin light, the kind that never really warms the room, just paints it in honesty. Margaret Blake sat by her kitchen window, staring at the photograph Evelyn had left on the table. The edges had begun to curl. The image of that younger man, Charles Quinn, Henry Vaughan, or whatever name he wore, then smiling as if the camera had never seen his lies. Her tea had gone cold, but her memories hadn't. She had been 23 when she met him. The year was 1988, in a small Louisiana town that smelled of river mud and magnolia blossoms. Margaret Hale, that was her name, then worked at a general store that sold everything from nails to coffee beans. She was saving to move west, dreaming of nursing school, of a life that felt larger than a single street. He arrived one afternoon in a beige sedan, all charm and mystery, saying he was from Texas and in town on business. His name was Henry Vaughan. He bought supplies he didn't need, stayed longer than he should, asked questions he had no right to ask. And he smiled the kind of smile that could make a girl forget what her father warned her about men who talk too smooth. He returned the next day, and the next. He'd bring small gifts, a book of poems, a silver lighter, a story about the cities he'd seen. He said he admired how calm she was, how her eyes never rushed to please. She didn't know then that admiration was just another kind of hunger. 3 weeks later, she woke up in a field outside town with a torn dress and the smell of whiskey in the air. She never saw Henry Vaughan again. Her family didn't believe her. Her father said she must have enticed the man. Her mother said nothing, just cried into her apron. By autumn, Margaret was showing. They sent her away to an aunt in Oregon, a quiet exile disguised as opportunity. That's where she had Ryan. She named him after the river near the cabin where she worked as a seamstress. For years, it was just the two of them, poverty and peace in equal measure. She never spoke his father's name again, until now. Margaret blinked, pulling herself back to the present. The photograph lay under her palm. Her hands trembled as if holding it might make the past less real. But it was real, the same eyes, the same sharp jaw, the same faint scar near the temple. Henry Vaughan had become Charles Quinn, the powerful executive who had slithered his way into the Hart family's empire. And the man who'd used her was now the man who had used her son. The nausea came fast. She barely made it to the sink before her stomach emptied itself, 30 years of silence rising like poison. That evening, she called Evelyn. "I want to tell you everything," she said, "because if I don't, it'll rot me from the inside." Evelyn's voice was calm. "Then tell me. I'll listen." They met at the small diner near the river, the same one where Evelyn had once waited for Ryan after his shifts. It was empty now except for the hum of the refrigerator and the rain tapping against the roof. Margaret wrapped her hands around the mug of coffee, even though it burned. "I thought if I left Louisiana, I'd left him," she began. "I thought moving north would mean safety, but men like him, they don't die. They just change their names." Evelyn leaned forward. "How did he find his way back into your life?" "It wasn't him who found me," Margaret said quietly. "It was me who didn't recognize him." She looked away, ashamed. "Years later, when Ryan married you, I saw the wedding photos. I thought Charles looked familiar, but I couldn't place it. I told myself it was coincidence." Maybe that's what mothers do. They choose the lie that hurts less. Evelyn swallowed. "And when you saw that photo I brought," Margaret nodded, "I knew. The way he stood, the way he looked at the camera like he owned it. I'd seen that face above me once, when I was too young to know what power could do." Her voice cracked, but she didn't cry. "That man built his life on other people's silence. Mine, your father's, your husband's. Every sin of his was a seed planted in someone else's ruin. Evelyn whispered. You don't have to keep carrying it. Margaret smiled sadly. Don't I? Every time I look at Ryan, I see both the child I raised and the blood I tried to forget. The two women sat in the dim light, the truth circling between them like smoke. After a long pause, Margaret said, Do you know what's worse than being hurt? Evelyn, it's watching your child become a reflection of the man who hurt you. Evelyn nodded slowly. I think I do. They left the diner near midnight. The rain had stopped, but the air smelled of it still. Evelyn helped Margaret to her car. Their movements slow, quiet, fragile. Before she got in, Margaret turned to her. Don't tell Ryan yet, she said. Let me do it. I owe him that truth, even if it kills what's left between us. Evelyn hesitated. He'll hate him. Margaret's eyes glistened. Then maybe he'll finally hate the right man. When Evelyn drove home that night, the city felt changed, as if the streets themselves were carrying secrets. She replayed Margaret's words in her head. Every sin of his was a seed planted in someone else's ruin. That was the truth about men like Charles Quinn. They didn't destroy you all at once. They let you bloom first, and then poison the roots. Meanwhile, Margaret sat alone in her living room, the photograph still on the table. She took a lighter, the same silver one she had kept all these years, and held the flame to the edge. For a moment, the fire caught his eyes first. They turned to smoke before the rest of him followed. She whispered to the ashes, You don't get to live in this house anymore. Then she opened the window, letting the ash scatter into the night. The wind carried it toward the dark horizon, toward the man who would soon face the truth he'd buried under other people's lives. Across the city, in a high-rise office lit only by moonlight, Charles Quinn stood by the window, sipping his whiskey, watching the rain streak the glass. He felt uneasy, though he couldn't say why. Maybe it was an instinct, the kind of chill that comes before a reckoning. He didn't know that somewhere, in a small blue house, a woman had just burned his name, and that the truth, long buried under decades of silence, had begun to breathe again. The next morning, fog draped the city like a secret. The sky had forgotten what color it was, and the streets carried the weight of something unspoken. Evelyn Hart arrived early at the Hartson Group headquarters. The only sound in the lobby, the click of her heels against marble. She hadn't slept. Margaret Blake's story haunted her, the truth, so impossible it felt like fiction. But fiction couldn't ruin lives this thoroughly. Only blood could. Ethan Ward was already in her office, hunched over his laptop, eyes sharp behind dark frames. "You're here early," he said without looking up. "Couldn't sleep. she replied. He gestured to the screen. Neither could I. He turned the laptop toward her. On the display were 2 digital documents. One labeled DNA, sequence report. Robert Hart, Charles Quinn. The other DNA, sequence report, Ryan Blake, Charles Quinn. Evelyn's pulse thudded. What is this? I pulled the medical archives from the accident case. Ethan said, Mr. Trent gave me permission to access the company's genetic records, part of the Hartson legacy files your father kept in private storage. I wanted to verify something. He pointed to the numbers, the identical markers highlighted in red. Charles and Ryan, he said. They share a paternal match, 99.9%. Evelyn leaned back, gripping the edge of her chair. God, it's real. Ethan said quietly. Charles Quinn isn't just the man who ruined your company. He's Ryan's father. The air left the room. Evelyn could hear her own heartbeat, heavy and erratic. The puzzle she'd been avoiding had solved itself, and the picture it made was monstrous. Does Ryan know? She asked. Ethan shook his head. No, but Margaret does. She called me this morning, told me not to tell him. She said she wanted to do it herself. Evelyn nodded slowly. She's right. That truth belongs to her. Ethan hesitated. There's more. He opened another folder. This one marked Private Financial Transfers, 1988-1992. Charles was paying hush money to a woman under the name Margaret Hale. Thousands of dollars over several years. The payments stopped the year Ryan turned 5. Evelyn stared at the dates, the cruel arithmetic of betrayal. He bought his silence. She whispered, and hers. Ethan's voice softened. He bought everything, Evelyn, except forgiveness. By afternoon, the city had shaken off its fog, but Evelyn hadn't. She met Mr. Trent in his apartment overlooking the river. He was reading when she arrived, glasses perched low on his nose, a scarf wrapped loosely around his neck. His face had aged another year since last week, or maybe it was just the light. She told him everything, the DNA, the payments, Margaret's story. When she finished, he closed the book and sighed. I always knew Charles's sins ran deeper than greed, but this, he shook his head. This is biblical. Evelyn frowned. What do? We do what your father would have done, Trent said. We bring it to light, carefully, without vengeance. You've already burned one empire. Don't start another. Evelyn smiled faintly. That sounds like something he'd say. He raised you to build, not destroy. Trent said gently, let truth do the burning this time. Evelyn turned toward the window. The Willamette River shimmered below, gray and calm. What if the truth destroys more than it saves? She asked. Trent looked at her, eyes kind. Then it was never worth saving. That evening, Margaret called. Her voice was fragile, frayed around the edges. I told him, she said. Evelyn froze. Ryan. Yes, what did he do? Silence on the line. Then, softly, he laughed. The kind of laugh that sounds like breaking glass. Evelyn closed her eyes. Where is he now? He left. Margaret whispered. Said he needed air. Said he wished I'd lied. Ryan drove for hours that night. No direction, just motion. The road wound through the city, out toward the hills, into the kind of darkness that doesn't ask questions. He could still hear his mother's voice. He's your father, Ryan. The words scraped like sandpaper. He pulled over near the river, got out, and walked toward the water. The rain had started again, soft but relentless. Charles Quinn was his father, the man who had manipulated him, betrayed him, turned him against Evelyn, his blood. He wanted to vomit, to scream, to erase every resemblance. He looked down at his hands, remembering the time Charles had taught him how to sign a document, how to forge confidence like a weapon, a man's worth. Charles had said, is in how well he hides his weaknesses. Now Ryan understood he hadn't been learning business. He'd been learning survival from a man who had never survived anything honestly. He punched the railing hard enough to split his knuckles. Blood ran down his hand, warm against the cold rain, the color of truth. Back in the city, Evelyn received a call from Detective Moore. We have something. He said, a file from 30 years ago, Louisiana State Records, Charles Quinn, under the name Henry Vaughn, was charged with sexual assault, but the case was dismissed. The victim's name was sealed, but now that we know, Evelyn finished the sentence. Margaret Blake. Moore exhaled. We're reopening it. There's no statute of limitations on what he did afterward. Fraud, coercion, falsified identity. He's not walking away this time. Evelyn hung up and stared at the skyline. The lights of the city flickered like nervous stars. Justice was coming, but it didn't feel like victory. It felt like a requiem. Later that night, Margaret sat alone on her porch, wrapped in a blanket. She heard footsteps and looked up to see Ryan walking toward her. His face was pale, his clothes soaked. He didn't speak for a while. He just stood there, shaking, staring at her as if she were both mother and stranger. I should hate you, he said finally. Margaret nodded. I know, but I don't. He whispered. I hate him, and I hate myself for being like him. You're not him, she said firmly. You're the part of him that he tried to bury and couldn't. Ryan sat down beside her. The rain softened, then stopped. He stared at his bandaged knuckles, at the blood dried around his wrist. I don't know how to live with this, he said. You don't live with it, Margaret said softly. You live through it. He leaned his head against her shoulder. For the first time since he was a boy, he let himself cry. Across the river, Evelyn watched the storm fade. The city lights blinked against the clouds. Somewhere out there, a son was mourning the father he never truly had. Somewhere else, a mother was forgiving the man who destroyed her youth, and Evelyn, standing at the window, whispered to the night, some sins aren't inherited, they're chosen. The wind carried her words into the dark, to the man sitting alone in his penthouse, sipping his whiskey, feeling the tremor of a name he thought he'd buried long ago. Charles Quinn poured another drink, but his hands shook too much to lift it. He didn't know why not yet, but he could feel it. The blood and the sin were coming for him, together like a reckoning written in his own DNA. The night before it all began, Portland went silent. No thunder, no rain, just a heavy kind of stillness, like the city was holding its breath for what it knew was coming. Evelyn Hart sat in her office at Hart's and Group long after the lights had gone out. The only illumination came from the street below, bleeding through the blinds like a heartbeat. Across the desk, Ethan Ward laid out the final documents. This will work, he said quietly. Once Charles takes the bait, the rest falls into place. Evelyn nodded, but said nothing. Her mind was a storm, her father's voice, Margaret's pain, Ryan's tears. All of it had led to this one night, the end of a long, poisonous bloodline. Mr. Trent sat in the corner, his breathing shallow but steady. Remember, he said, justice is not vengeance. What we're doing must hold up in the light of day. It will, Evelyn said softly, because this time we're not hiding. The plan was simple in structure, impossible in emotion. Margaret Blake had agreed to meet Charles Quinn under the pretense of reconciliation, a quiet dinner between old business partners. She would wear a small recording device hidden beneath the brooch on her coat, provided by Detective Moore. The conversation would be transmitted directly to the team monitoring from Ethan's laptop in Evelyn's office. Charles had always believed himself untouchable. That arrogance was the trap. At 8:43 p.m., Margaret walked into the lantern room, the same bar where, 30 years ago, Henry Vaughan had bought her a drink and changed her life forever. The universe has a cruel sense of poetry. The place hadn't changed much. Low light, red leather booths, the faint smell of bourbon and old lies. She sat in the back, her heart steady only because it had broken too many times to remember how to race. Charles arrived 5 minutes later, immaculate as always, arrogance pressed into every fold of his tailored suit. He smiled when he saw her, a practiced smile, one that had fooled too many for too long. "Margaret," he said smoothly, taking off his gloves, "you look unchanged." She smiled faintly. "That's a polite way of saying time's been kind." "It has," he said, sitting across from her, "to both of us." The waiter poured wine. Charles didn't notice her trembling hand. He thought he was still the hunter. "So," he said, leaning back. "What did you want to discuss? I assume this isn't about nostalgia." Margaret met his gaze, calm as still water. "You owe me something," Charles chuckled. "I owe many people things." "Darling, you'll have to be specific." "I'm not your darling," she said sharply, "and what you owe me isn't money. It's truth." The smile faded. "Truth is expensive. Are you sure you can afford it?" "I paid for it 30 years ago," she said. He stiffened. His hand paused halfway to his glass. "What did you just say?" "You heard me. Henry." He froze. The name hit him like a physical blow. The mask slipped, just for a second. Then he laughed, brittle, dangerous. "I don't know what you think you know," he said. "I know everything," she whispered. "The assault, the payments, the forged identity, the son you abandoned and used like a pawn." Charles leaned forward, voice low. "Be careful, Margaret. You're walking on thin ice." "I've lived on ice for 30 years, she replied. "You can't scare a woman who's already drowned." In Evelyn's office, the recording played through a soft crackle. Every word was a blade. Ethan adjusted the volume. "He's cracking," he murmured. "Mr. Trent nodded grimly. "He'll try to twist it. He always does." Evelyn didn't answer. Her fingers dug into the arm of the chair, knuckles white, listening to Margaret's calm voice, to the venom in Charles's tone. She felt something between fury and awe. Her phone buzzed a message from Detective Moore. "We're outside the restaurant. Say the word." "Not yet," she whispered. "Let him confess first." Back at the lantern room, the tension had thickened into something almost solid. Charles's composure fractured. "You think you can blackmail me with stories from the past? I've buried bigger scandals than you." Margaret smiled, weary but defiant. Then you should have buried them deeper. You don't know what you're doing, he hissed. I know exactly what I'm doing, she said. I'm ending what you started. You took everything from me, my youth, my peace, my son's father. But tonight, you give me something back. And what's that? Your name. Charles laughed, but it sounded more like a growl. You think anyone will believe you? She leaned in. I don't need them to believe me. I just need you to admit it. He sneered. You want me to say it out loud? Fine, yes. I was Henry Vaughan. Yes. I left you. And yes. The boy Ryan, he's mine. Are you happy now? There was silence. Even the air seemed to pause. Then Margaret's voice, soft as a prayer. No, but I'm free. Got it, Ethan said, hitting record twice for redundancy. Mr. Trent exhaled. That's the confession. Evelyn stood, her face unreadable. Send it to Moore. 5 minutes later, as Charles stood to leave, the door to the lantern room burst open. 2 officers stepped in, badges glinting under the dim light. Charles Quinn, one said, you're under arrest for identity fraud, coercion, and obstruction of justice. For the first time in his life, Charles didn't have a line ready. He just stared at Margaret, the smirk gone, replaced by something raw recognition, maybe even shame. As they cuffed him, he whispered, You've ruined everything. Margaret looked him in the eye. No, Henry, I just stopped pretending it wasn't already ruined. Evelyn and Ethan arrived minutes later. Margaret stood outside, rain starting to fall again. The police car's lights flashing red and blue against the wet pavement. Evelyn placed a hand on her shoulder. You did it. Margaret shook her head. No, I just told the truth. Ethan smiled faintly. Sometimes that's the bravest thing. Margaret watched the car pull away. He'll rot in prison, she said softly. But I'll still see him every time I look at Ryan. That's the part no sentence can fix. Evelyn's voice broke. Maybe it's not about fixing. Maybe it's about not bleeding anymore. Margaret nodded. Then let's stop bleeding. Across town, in the rain-slick streets of Portland, the world kept moving indifferent, unstoppable, but inside one small circle of lives. Something had finally shifted. The past, for the first time, was cornered. And as dawn broke hours later, Evelyn realized the truth was never just a weapon. It was also a wound, one that could finally, mercifully, begin to close. The morning Charles Quinn was arrested, Portland woke to a kind of silence that felt earned. The sky was clear for the first time in weeks. No rain, no fog, just a sharp, pale sun cutting through the glass towers like truth through deceit. Evelyn Hart watched the news from her apartment. The anchor's voice was calm, detached. Business magnate Charles Quinn, CEO of the Hartson Group, was taken into custody late last night following new evidence linking him to identity fraud, corporate coercion, and a decades-old assault case under the alias Henry Vaughn. Sources close to the investigation confirm the case may expand into a multi-state criminal inquiry. She muted the television. The sound of justice had never felt so quiet. Outside, the city kept moving. Inside, Evelyn sat still. There was no triumph in her chest, only a hollow ache. She had won, but victories carved from pain rarely left anything whole. Her phone buzzed. It was Margaret. Margaret. He knows. Evelyn, Ryan, Margaret. He saw the news. Evelyn hesitated before typing back, "I'll come by." When she arrived, the Blake house was different. The curtains were drawn, the air heavy with the smell of burnt coffee and sleepless hours. Margaret sat on the couch, her hands clasped, eyes rimmed red. "He's in the back," she whispered. "Hasn't said a word since dawn." Evelyn nodded. She walked down the narrow hallway, the old floor creaking like it recognized the weight of her again. Ryan Blake sat by the window of his childhood room, staring at the backyard. The garden was unkempt, wild like everything else that had once been tended but abandoned. He didn't look at her when she entered. "You knew," he said flatly. Evelyn's breath caught. "Margaret told me only after she found out. I didn't want to keep it from you. She asked me to wait." Ryan laughed under his breath, the sound bitter. "You've both been waiting my entire life, haven't you? Waiting to see what kind of monster I'd turn into." "Don't," she said softly. He stood and turned toward her. His face was pale, eyes raw from lack of sleep. "Don't. What?" "Don't be angry that the man who raised me wasn't my father, and the man who ruined me was. Don't hate myself for having his blood in my veins. You're not him," Evelyn said. He shook his head. "But I was built by him. Every decision I made, the lies, the deals, the way I treated you, it all started with the part of me that looks like him." "You're not his legacy," she said, stepping closer. "You're his consequence." Ryan blinked, his voice shaking. "You think that helps?" "No," she admitted, "but it's the truth, and I think you've run from it long enough." He turned back toward the window. Outside, The wind moved through the trees, whispering something neither of them could name. I saw him on TV, Ryan said after a moment, handcuffed, head down. I should have felt relief. Instead, I felt like I was watching myself being dragged away. Evelyn's voice softened. Because you still love him? He didn't answer. The silence said enough. She stepped closer. Love doesn't always mean forgiveness, Ryan. Sometimes it's just the part of you that still wants to understand what broke you. He closed his eyes. You make it sound so easy. It isn't, she said. But it's possible. Margaret appeared in the doorway, hesitant. Ryan, she whispered. He turned, his expression torn between rage and sorrow. Why didn't you tell me? Margaret swallowed hard. Because I didn't want to ruin what you thought you had. You were finally happy. You had Evelyn, your career, your name. What mother would take that away? You took away my truth, he said. You let me build my life on lies. I was trying to protect you from what he snapped, from being him. It didn't work. Margaret flinched, but didn't look away. Maybe not, but I did the best I could with the pieces I had left. The room felt smaller, air thicker. Evelyn watched the two of them, realizing she was standing in the middle of a history that wasn't hers, but had shaped her all the same. Ryan's voice broke. You should have told me. Mom, I could have hated him sooner. Margaret stepped forward, trembling. And then what? Ryan, would it have saved you? Would it have made you love yourself any better, knowing who your father was? He didn't answer. His silence was louder than anything he could have said. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. I thought if I stayed quiet, the past would die. But it didn't. It just raised you. Ryan's breath hitched. So what am I supposed to do with this live? She whispered. Live in a way he never could. He stared at her for a long moment. Then his shoulders slumped. I don't know if I can. Evelyn spoke then, her voice barely above a whisper. You can, because you already are. You chose to come here instead of running. You're still here. That's how it starts. Hours later, when the sun dipped low, Evelyn stood outside the house with Margaret. The sky was streaked with orange and gray, like fire refusing to die. Margaret's voice was fragile. He won't look at me the same again. Evelyn put a hand on her arm. He will. Just not yet. Margaret nodded slowly. You think he can forgive me? Eventually, Evelyn said, but first, he has to forgive himself. They stood in silence as the evening breeze moved through the trees. Somewhere inside, a floorboard creaked, Ryan pacing, restless, alive. Margaret sighed. You know what the cruelest thing about motherhood is. You spend your whole life trying to shield your child from pain, and in the end, you realize pain was the only thing that made them real. Evelyn looked at her, eyes glistening. Maybe that's love, Margaret, letting them feel everything you couldn't bear to. Later that night, Ryan sat alone in his car by the river, the same place where his father once stood. The reflection of the city lights shimmered on the water, blurring like memory. He took out his phone, typed a message to Evelyn, then erased it, typed another, to his mother, then erased that too. Finally, he whispered to the empty car, "I don't know who I am anymore." But the river answered for him, soft and steady, like a mother's voice. "You're the one who survived." Ryan leaned back, eyes closed, tears mixing with the hum of the night. For the first time, he wasn't angry. He was just human. And somewhere across town, Margaret sat awake, her heart heavy but whole for the first time in decades. The truth hadn't destroyed her. It had returned to finish what silence began. The prison was built on the edge of the city, where the air smelled of metal and rain. A place stripped of beauty on purpose, so no one forgot where they were. Margaret Blake had not planned to come here. She had told herself that justice was enough, that silence would protect what was left of her peace. But peace has a way of demanding more. It doesn't settle for the absence of noise. It wants closure. She walked through the long corridor behind a correctional officer, her steps echoing against the concrete. The fluorescent lights hummed faintly above her head, sterile and endless. In her hand, she carried a small envelope, a single photograph of Ryan as a boy, taken the summer he'd lost his first tooth. She didn't know why she'd brought it, maybe as proof that love could still exist on the same earth as evil. When they led her into the visitation room, Charles Quinn was already waiting. He sat on the other side of a metal table, hands cuffed, posture still proud. Prison hadn't changed his composure, only stripped it of its polish. The once tailored suits were gone, replaced by gray cotton and a number printed across his chest. But the arrogance remained in his eyes. "Margaret," he said, leaning forward with that same smooth tone she had once mistaken for charm. "I wasn't expecting you. I wasn't expecting to come," she replied, sitting down. He smiled faintly, curiosity, then closure. She met his gaze, forgiveness. His smile faltered. "You think you can forgive me?" "No," she said softly. "I think I can forgive myself. That's why I'm here." He studied her for a long time, confusion flickering in his eyes. "You've changed." So have you, she said, only I became something human. For a moment, neither spoke. The room was filled with the distant hum of voices from other visitors, the clatter of keys, the occasional cough. It was almost ordinary, which somehow made it worse. Finally, Charles said, "You must hate me." I did, Margaret said, for a long time. I let it rot me. I built my days around that hatred. It kept me warm when I was cold, kept me company when I was alone. But hate is a poor substitute for purpose. He leaned back, unimpressed. And now you've come for what? To tell me I'm forgiven, that I'm redeemed? Margaret shook her head. No, redemption is between you and whatever God you believe in. I just came to take my name back from your shadow. He laughed under his breath. You always had a way with words. She ignored the jab. You used my life to build yours. You used my silence to buy your freedom. You used my son as your puppet, and still, you lost. His jaw tightened. I didn't lose. I built an empire. You built a grave, she said quietly. You just mistook it for a kingdom. Charles looked away then, his arrogance thinning. You don't know what it's like to be powerless, he said, to start from nothing and have the world spit in your face. I took what I needed. I became someone. That's survival. Margaret's voice hardened. No, that's theft. You didn't survive the world, Charles. You infected it. He met her eyes again. Something flickering there, anger, or maybe guilt trying to disguise itself. And yet, here you are, he said, still chasing me after all these years. I'm not chasing you, she said. I'm burying you. The silence that followed was colder than the room. After a while, Margaret slid the envelope across the table. That's Ryan, she said. The boy you never met. The son you used like a pawn. I thought you should see who he became in spite of you. Charles opened it reluctantly. The photo was faded, but the boy's smile was bright, wide, unbroken. For a moment, Charles's hand trembled. He ran a finger over the image, tracing the outline of a child he would never know. He has your eyes, he muttered. No, she said. He has mine. The eyes of someone who learned to see pain and still choose kindness. He put the photo down slowly. Does he know you came here? Not yet, she said. He wouldn't understand. Charles's voice softened, or maybe weakened. He hates me, doesn't he? Margaret nodded. He does, and that's his right. But someday, I hope he finds the strength to hate you less, not for your sake, for his. He laughed again. but this time it cracked halfway. "You think that makes you noble, no?" she said. "It makes me free." And they sat in silence. For the first time, Margaret noticed the faint tremor in his hands, the way his shoulders slumped when he thought no one was looking. He was smaller now, hollowed out from the inside. She felt no pity, only recognition, the kind that says we were both alive once, before you decided to steal that from me, after a long time. She stood. Charles looked up. "That's it?" "Yes," she said. "That's all I came to say." He frowned. "Don't you want to know why I did it?" She paused. "No, because no answer will make sense to someone who still believes in love." He tried to smirk, but it faltered. "You'll never escape me, Margaret. I live in your sun, in your memories, in every breath you take when you remember my name." She smiled faintly. "Then maybe it's time you lived in a grave, Henry." She turned to leave, but his voice stopped her. "Margaret," he said quietly, "if there's another life after this, do you think they'll forgive me there?" She didn't turn around. "Not until you do it here." And then she walked away. Outside, the rain had begun again, gentle this time, not violent. Margaret stepped out into it, lifting her face toward the gray sky. The drops ran down her cheeks, mixing with tears she hadn't realized were there. She whispered into the wind, "It's done." Her heart was trembling, but lighter than it had been in 30 years. Forgiveness hadn't erased what he did. It had simply stopped him from owning what came after. Later that evening, she returned home. Ryan was sitting on the porch, the same way his father had once waited for her outside the courthouse decades ago. But his expression was different, open, uncertain. "Where were you?" he asked. "Closing a door," she said. He looked at her for a long time. "You went to see him, didn't you?" She nodded. "Why, to remind myself that I survived," she said. Ryan swallowed. "Did you forgive him?" Margaret hesitated, then said, "I forgave myself for letting him steal my voice. That's enough." He looked down at his hands. "I don't think I can forgive him." "You don't have to," she said softly. "Just don't become him." He met her gaze, and in that moment, something wordless passed between them, understanding, grief, maybe even the beginning of peace. Margaret reached out, brushed his cheek with trembling fingers. "You're free now, Ryan, so live like it." He nodded, tears brimming but unshed. "So are you, Mom." She smiled faintly. "Maybe." but freedom feels a lot like quiet. I think I'll have to learn to love that. They sat together as the rain fell, not as punishment this time, but as cleansing. And somewhere far away, behind prison walls, a man whispered a name he'd stolen and finally understood what it meant to lose everything he thought he owned. The night was colder than it should have been for spring. Evelyn Hart was halfway through reading case notes in her office when her phone rang. The kind of ring that makes your stomach drop before you even answer. Ms. Hart. The voice on the line was strained. Official. This is Detective Moore. There's been an incident. Evelyn's pen fell from her hand. What kind of incident? Ryan Blake, Moore said. He was attacked outside a diner on 5th. He's stable for now, but you should come. The world went silent for a second. Then everything started moving too fast. When Evelyn arrived at the hospital, the hallways smelled of antiseptic and rain-soaked clothes. Margaret Blake was already there, sitting in a plastic chair near the emergency room door. Her cardigan was wet. Her hands clasped around a rosary she hadn't touched in years. Evelyn knelt beside her. What happened? Margaret's eyes were wide but far away. They said it was one of Charles's old associates, someone who thought Ryan was helping the police build a new case. Her voice cracked. He was just having coffee. Evelyn squeezed her hand. He's alive. For now. Margaret whispered. They're still operating. The words hung there like fragile glass, one tremor away from shattering. Hours later, a doctor came out with tired eyes and blood on his gloves. He's stable, he said. The knife missed any vital arteries, but he lost a lot of blood. He'll need rest and someone to watch over him. Margaret nodded. He has us. The doctor smiled faintly, then left them alone. When they entered the room, Ryan was pale against the white sheets. His right arm was bandaged. An IV line ran into his wrist. His chest rose and fell in small, stubborn movements, the rhythm of someone who has decided, however unconsciously, not to give up. Evelyn sat beside him. Margaret stood near the window, staring at the rain beginning again outside. For a while, no one spoke. The only sound was the monitor's steady beep. Then Evelyn said softly, "He looks peaceful." Margaret shook her head. "He looks like every man who thought he could escape his past." Evelyn glanced up. "You blame yourself, I always have," she said. Every time he got hurt as a boy, as a man, I wondered if it was my punishment for what I'd done, or for what I hadn't done soon enough. Evelyn stood, moved beside her. "You saved him tonight, Margaret. You raised him into someone who could face the truth and still choose to live. That's not punishment. That's grace." Margaret's eyes filled. You sound like my priest. Evelyn smiled faintly. Maybe just someone who believes in redemption. Hours passed. Nurses came and went. Night deepened outside the window until the streetlights glowed like small, forgiving suns. Ryan woke near midnight, his eyes fluttering open. "Hey," Evelyn said softly, leaning forward. He blinked, confused. "Where?" "The hospital," she said. "You're safe." He looked around weakly, saw his mother standing in the corner. "Mom," he whispered. Margaret came closer, taking his hand. "I'm here, sweetheart. What happened? You were attacked," she said. "But you're all right now." He closed his eyes, exhaling shakily. "I thought I was done paying for his sins." Margaret brushed his hair back gently. "You were never paying for him, Ryan. You were paying for yourself for carrying something that was never yours to carry." He looked at her, eyes glassy. "It hurts." "I know," she whispered. "It always does when something starts to heal." Evelyn watched them, something in her chest tightening. The way Margaret held his hand, the way Ryan leaned into her touch, it wasn't just a mother and son. It was two survivors, holding the broken pieces of their story together long enough to turn them into something whole. 2 days later, the sunlight found its way through the hospital blinds. Ryan was stronger now, sitting upright, bandage peeking from under his sleeve. Margaret was knitting by the window. Evelyn was flipping through a newspaper. The headline read, "Quinn associate arrested in retaliation attack." Justice was moving again, slow, inevitable. Ryan looked at Evelyn. "You stayed. Someone had to make sure you didn't run," she said. He smiled weakly. "I'm done running." Margaret looked up. "Good, because I'm too old to chase you." They all laughed softly, a strange, gentle sound after so much silence. Evelyn leaned closer. "When you get out of here, what's next?" He stared at his bandaged hand for a moment. "Maybe I'll disappear for a while, find a quiet place, fix something that isn't broken yet." Evelyn nodded. "You'll know where to find me if you need help." "I always did," he said, meeting her eyes. "I just didn't know how to ask." That evening, as the nurses dimmed the lights, Margaret stepped outside to get some air. The sunset painted the sky in bruised gold. She stood on the terrace, watching the world move on. Evelyn joined her after a while. "He's sleeping," she said. Margaret nodded. "He looks like he did when he was a boy, before the world taught him shame." They stood in silence, both watching the horizon. After a long pause, Margaret said quietly, "You know, I used to think pain was a punishment, that what happened to me was the price of loving too much. But now I think it's the opposite. Maybe pain is just love trying to grow somewhere it shouldn't, breaking through the skin until you finally understand what it means to be alive. Evelyn looked at her. You sound like someone who's forgiven herself. Margaret smiled faintly. I'm learning. The next morning, Ryan was discharged. He walked out slowly, arm around his mother, Evelyn carrying the flowers that had piled up in his room. The sky was clear blue, unbothered. They stopped outside the hospital doors. Margaret turned to Evelyn. You saved us both, she said. Evelyn shook her head. No, you saved me first. Margaret hugged her a long, trembling embrace that smelled of lavender and courage. When she pulled away, she looked at her son. You ready to start over? Ryan smiled, the first real one in years. Only if you are. She nodded. Then let's go home. Weeks later, Evelyn visited them at the small coastal town where they'd moved, a quiet place with white fences and salt in the air. The house was modest, filled with light. Ryan was painting the porch. Margaret was tending to a small garden, humming to herself. Evelyn stood by the gate, watching them. For the first time, the sight didn't hurt. It healed. Margaret looked up and smiled. You're just in time for lunch. Evelyn returned the smile. I didn't bring much. You brought peace, Margaret said. That's more than enough. That night, after dinner, they walked together along the beach. The tide was low, the horizon glowing faintly pink. Ryan walked ahead, hands in his pockets. Margaret and Evelyn followed behind, the wind tugging softly at their hair. Margaret spoke without looking up. You know what the strange thing about wounds is? Evelyn tilted her head. What? They never disappear completely, but one day, you touch them, and they don't hurt anymore. That's how you know you've healed. Evelyn nodded. Maybe that's what forgiveness really is, learning to live with the scar. Margaret smiled, eyes glistening in the fading light. Then maybe we're finally healed. They stood there until the sun dipped beneath the water, leaving only the soft whisper of waves. Not mourning, not angry, just endless, forgiving. And somewhere behind them, the old world, the lies, the pain, the ghosts stayed where it belonged, buried but remembered, because healing doesn't mean forgetting. It means the wound no longer owns you. In the end, the past didn't vanish. It simply lost its power to wound. The scars remained not as reminders of pain, but as proof of survival. This was Unforgiven, Part 3, The Wound of a Mother, a story about love that learned to let go and forgiveness that finally found its voice. If this story stayed with you tonight, subscribe to Calm Mind Journal, where every wound becomes a whisper and every whisper learns to heal.